And I do feel a lot of gratitude to be in a place where I feel purpose in my life. Not everyone gets to work in a job they like. Not everyone gets to work in a job, particularly at the moment. And not everyone gets to feel their life has purpose and their life makes a sense. And so for these things, I do feel gifted and I do feel privileged. Now, I say that as a precursor to saying that's not to say I don't feel frustrated sometimes working in the religious biz, particularly when I get together often with other clergy outside our little family of faith. And there are days in those contexts that I want to bang my head against many walls. Once I imagined that me growing up and maturing in the faith would mean that I would become more patient and accepting. I would take on a Christ-like peace on a daily basis. But what I've learned over the years, if anything, being a minister in several different expressions of the church over the years has made me grumpier, if anything. Gatherings of professional clergy, in particular when they're representing different traditions, they have a way of wasting time and energy and oxygen, to me, on tedious conversations that, in my opinion, have zero relevance or importance. I often just have to step out of those meetings to spend a few minutes outside just breathing and recharging my patience, lest I stand up in the midst of those meetings and scream, "Look, you idiots. There's a hurting world out there. People are doing it hard. They are longing for peace. They are longing for meaning. They are longing to know they are loved. They are longing to be fed. They're longing to be sheltered. They're longing to just belong somewhere, and you intend for us to spend all afternoon debating, choosing Christmas carols. You, the one over there who cares too much, pick whatever ones you like and let's move the heck on." It gets far worse, though, than just, say, choosing hymns for an ecumenical service. A few years back, I was trapped, and I do mean trapped, in a meeting of Roman Catholic seminarians and Anglican seminarians. And I was working for the Uniting Church at the time, so I had no idea what I was doing there. And what do you reckon that meeting of apprentice priests from both sides of the Tiber River was about? Was it learning from mutual institutional sins of the past? That would be valuable. Was it about considering the shifting ground of our cultural landscape in the 21st century? Was it for ways for priests in traditional roles to step out from the sanctuary, past the walls of the church building, and do some actual ministry out there in the world? No, it was nothing so possibly useful. This circular gabfest that went nowhere fast for several hours was on the differences between the Romans and the Anglicans' understanding of Mary. Now, this conversation was very interesting to me for about 3 minutes, and then I spent the rest of the time trying to remind the room that our personal opinions and the doctrinal positions of our institutions and all our self-indulgent hair-splitting didn't really matter a hang out there in the real world. And sure, if we respect ecumenism, and we should acknowledge that Mary of Nazareth, variously called in different traditions the Blessed Virgin, the Mother of God, the God-bearer, or Theotokos to the Orthodox, is a very big deal as a figure of veneration and devotion in the Roman Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, and other churches. And there is a very rich mystical tradition of Marian devotion from those churches that I find personally very spiritually nourishing. But there's also a bunch of wacko, weird doctrine gathered over centuries which I find distracting and pointless. And pointless religion to me is only one step down from harmful religion. The problem is when any tradition has tried to tie a neat bow on this conflated theology as Jesus' mum as some quasi-divine figure. And they've worked far too hard at that, and these things have just collected over the years. And to me, and this would be controversial to say in front of Catholic friends, but I feel like it's a hangover of Gnosticism, when people need to come up with stories about Mary back from a time when people didn't take the humanity of Jesus very seriously. They really thought of him as just God's son. That was it. There was the incarnation wasn't taken very seriously, the human element of Jesus. And so when we come up with these massive kind of huge, epic, doctrinal kind of constructions around Mary, we miss her. We miss that young poor girl from Nazareth who said yes. We miss the Mary of Scripture. And particularly today, we miss the young Mary that I'm deeply moved and inspired by, that we meet in the first chapter of Luke. Now, some of us do get very distracted by the word virgin, and we could have all kinds of debates and explorations about why that word was used and what that means to the narrative and the story. And to be fair, we can't ignore it in Luke. It pops up 3 times in 8 verses, including young Mary using it to describe herself. And it is very natural for us today to hear that word and focus on the meaning of it being physically uninitiated in conjugal relationships. In the context of Mary's story, though, it also means very young, and it specifically means unmarried. In Luke, Mary's youth is very stark, and I say that because the word virgin in the Greek is used in place of woman or girl. She's never called a woman, she's never called a girl in the first 8 verses. She is called a virgin, refers to herself as a virgin. And so from that, we know Mary was female, and that she was between childhood and adulthood. She was neither described as a girl or a woman. And remembering, we're talking about an age in history where to be a woman was probably, 15, 16 years of age? She was younger than that. So she was biologically capable of conceiving a child, but too young to do so in her society's eyes. Imagine yourself today out at the local shops and you notice a girl, very young, maybe between 12 and 14 years of age, heavily pregnant. You see a girl that young, heavily pregnant, out at the shops, and what feelings does that inspire in you? Would you have a sense of awe and gratitude? Possibly more like you would feel pathos, you would feel pity, you would feel concern for that young woman and her circumstances. And would that young kid be proud of herself to be out in public? Would she be showing off her belly and smiling at you, head held high? Or would she avert her gaze from you, fearing either your judgment or your pity? And the early teenage pregnancy that Mary of Luke faced in her time was all the worst in that particular historical context, because Mary was a kid from Nazareth, a poor regional town. And yes, she was engaged, probably betrothed from a very young age to a local man with good, solid, steady work, and that was the best life she and her family could hope for her. A meagre income and a simple home in a poor rural town. She was not the daughter of affluent parents in a sizable town who could spend her pregnancy hidden from sight behind the walls of a family estate. That wasn't an option. She would have had to spend her entire pregnancy walking out daily in public life, to the well, to the market, out in the eyes and judgment of others, a young, teenaged, unmarried mother-to-be. And according to Luke, and this is a thing that I think is a very important point to make, completely different to Matthew, Mary was unmarried for the entirety of her pregnancy, including the birth of Jesus. That shakes up our thoughts, doesn't it, of the happy, holy family by the manger. And I know that I was just always taught to assume that Joseph had married Mary sometime before Jesus was born. That's what Matthew tells us. And I feel like my Sunday school teachers just allowed that. Let's just focus on the Matthew here. Matthew very clearly says they were married by the time Jesus came along. Luke says quite the opposite. In chapter 2, Joseph sets off to Bethlehem, his ancestral home, not Mary's ancestral home. She's been taken away to have a child somewhere she doesn't know, away from her community and family support. She's heavily pregnant, and Luke says they are still only engaged. He travels with a woman he's engaged to, not married. And I ask in this story in Luke, why hadn't Joseph made an honest woman or girl of her yet? Perhaps she was too young to be married by local rituals and standards. Perhaps there was no honourable way to be officially wed to a wife who was unexplainably pregnant. Maybe Joseph in Luke took months and months wrestling with the dilemma of what to do with a mysteriously pregnant betrothed. In Matthew, it's very clear. He had a divine dream and he makes a quick decision. That's not on the page in Luke. So maybe Joseph felt a concern to at least take care of Mercy and saw the census requiring him to travel to Bethlehem as a chance to bring her along and enable her to have her out of wedlock child out of sight of her neighbours in Nazareth. I'm sure we all remember the recent bad old days when single teenage mums would be taken off to the convent out of sight for a time to have their babies in secret. And as I said, Matthew's gospel has far more story for Joseph. He first quietly dismisses the pregnant Mary, then his mind is changed after having the dream. And Matthew is very careful, as I said, to make the point that by the time the expecting couple reached Bethlehem, they were indeed married. Luke has none of that. In Luke, Mary is a poor, unmarried teenage mother, and Jesus is born out of wedlock, both the Son of God and the child of a single teenage mum. I wonder what effect on our common theology might have occurred over centuries if imperial Christendom had referred less to Mary with pious titles like Blessed Virgin Mother and with more empathic descriptions like struggling teenage mum. If we ever needed further confirmation that God is not about social hierarchies and niceties and decorum, here it is in Luke. By society's standards, the birth of the Christ child in Luke is a scandal, and his young mother was the least of these. When the Song of Mary, that we sometimes call the Magnificat that we heard today, when Mary declares God has looked with favour on the lowliness of his servant, by which she means herself, she wasn't being modest. There's not a bit of pious humility there. She was acknowledging the obvious truth of a social lowliness. Female, young, poor, from a rural environment, unmarried, unexplainably a mother. So the one that the angel Gabriel said would be called the Son of the Most High grew inside the womb of a girl at the very bottom of the social pile. Talk about God flipping everything on its head. So, Christmas Day is coming. The Feast of the Nativity, it's less than a week away. And as a closing thought today, I encourage us all to spend these last few days of waiting, paying less mind generally to the heavenly elements of the Nativity story, until Christmas Day when it all comes together. The glory of God incarnate, the humanity of the story. But maybe this week, let go of the heavenly mindedness of all that. Let's let the angels in on Christmas Day. And let's be awed instead by a true miracle here, this wondrous, society-rattling scandal of Christ's birth in these humblest and most difficult of human circumstances, which affirms triumphantly that God's love has no shame, has no limitations, has no restrictions, and has the power to change everything that the world insists on. Amen.